Jean Harlow was Hollywood's greatest symbol of lust. Paul Bern, on the other hand, was a director burdened with a shameful secret: utter impotence. Their marriage, fueled by the MGM empire, collapsed after only 2 months, ending with the naked, bullet-riddled body of Paul Bern himself. But the real brutality wasn't in the pool of blood. It lay in the minutes that followed. No one called the police. Not a single ambulance siren sounded. The capitalists nonchalantly arrived, trampled on the scene, looted the evidence, and concocted the death into a perfect suicide scenario. In 1932, Hollywood, human lives were merely media risks to be cleaned up, and justice was always cheaper than box office revenue. The undisputed ruler of this machine was Louis B. Mayer, a man who viewed his actors as livestock controlled by legally binding morals clauses. Jean Harlow was MGM's most profitable, undeniable sex symbol, but her chaotic off-screen affairs threatened to destroy the studio. To neutralize her, Mayer forced her into a sham marriage with Paul Bern, a quiet studio executive hiding a devastating secret. He was fundamentally impotent. Bern carried a physiological secret that tormented every waking moment of his life. According to several biographers and persistent studio whispers, he suffered from an extreme physical underdevelopment. While the exact medical terminology of the era was imprecise, many historians argue the practical reality was that Bern possessed the physical attributes of a prepubescent boy. He was widely believed to be fundamentally impotent. In the hyper-masculine culture of the 1920s and 30s, this condition was an immediate societal cancellation. The culture possessed zero vocabulary for physical differences that did not align with traditional masculinity. There was no medical sympathy, no psychological support, and certainly no societal acceptance. Impotence was viewed not as a medical issue, but as a moral failing, a hilarious joke, and the ultimate cancellation of a man's worth. For Bern, living in Hollywood, the global epicenter of manufactured hyper-masculine virility, a city where men like Clark Gable and Gary Cooper defined the cultural standard of what it meant to be a man, his condition was a daily excruciating humiliation. He compensated for his physical perceived inadequacy by cultivating his intellect, his kindness, and his power within the studio system. But the shame corroded him entirely from the inside out. And this physical shame was compounded by a dark, legally precarious secret from his past. Long before he arrived in Hollywood, when he was a struggling actor in New York, Bern had lived with a woman named Dorothy Millette. They were never formally married in a church, but they lived together long enough to be considered husband and wife under common law. Dorothy was a fragile woman who suffered from severe mental illness. As Bern's career began to rise, Dorothy's mental state deteriorated catastrophically. She suffered a complete psychological collapse, unable to care for her, and terrified of how a mentally ill partner would impact his upward trajectory in the ruthless entertainment industry. Bern made a cold, calculated decision. He quietly committed Dorothy Millette to an upscale psychiatric sanatorium on the East Coast. He did not abandon her financially. He paid her medical bills for the rest of his life, but he abandoned her narratively. When Paul Bern moved to Los Angeles and reinvented himself as the powerful intellectual studio executive, he simply erased Dorothy from his history. He presented himself to the world as a lifelong bachelor. He lived in constant low-level terror that the press would discover the crazy wife he had hidden away in an asylum, a revelation that would shatter his cultivated image of serene respectability. This was the man Louis B. Mayer looked at when he needed to solve the Jean Harlow crisis. Mayer, a man whose intelligence network within his own studio rivaled the FBI, almost certainly knew the truth about Bern's physical condition. In the claustrophobic, gossip-fueled environment of MGM, secrets of that magnitude rarely stayed buried from the man who signed the checks. Mayer saw in Bern the perfect, pliable instrument for a corporate merger. The logic of the capitalist machine was flawlessly, brutally efficient. If Jean Harlow, the ultimate symbol of dangerous, untamed female sexuality, married Paul Bern, the respected intellectual father-confessor, the alchemy would instantly neutralize her toxic image. The public would look at the union and conclude that the platinum blonde had finally been tamed by a wise, respectable father figure. The marriage would serve as a baptism, washing away the sins of the homewrecker and replacing them with the halo of a dutiful wife. The threat of the religious boycott would evaporate. The box office revenue would be secured. But what was in it for Paul Bern? Why would a highly intelligent man, acutely aware of his physical limitations, agree to marry the most desired woman on the planet? Because the machine offered him the one thing he craved more than anything else, the ultimate impenetrable disguise. If Paul Bern, the quiet, diminutive intellectual, could successfully claim Jean Harlow as his bride, it would be the ultimate performance of alpha male supremacy. To the outside world, to the executives who mocked him behind his back, and to the aggressive culture of Hollywood, possessing the ultimate sex symbol would definitively answer any whispered questions about his masculinity. It was a chance to finally publicly prove that he was a real man. It was a devastatingly perfect convergence of vulnerabilities. The studio needed a human shield to protect their profits. Harlow needed a father figure to protect her from the press and her own destructive impulses. And Bern needed a goddess to protect him from his own shame. In the spring of 1932, the studio's gears engaged. The studio did not ask, they orchestrated. They subtly, relentlessly pushed the two vulnerable, deeply damaged people toward the altar. They created the environment, they managed the press, and they laid the groundwork for a wedding that was fundamentally a crisis management strategy written on a marriage certificate. The trap was set. The two victims were walking toward a highly publicized, studio-sanctioned bedroom, entirely unaware that the collision of their profound internal traumas would soon detonate, leaving behind a shattered illusion, a naked corpse, and a crime scene that the studio was already preparing to erase. The 2nd of July, 1932, was not a day of romantic culmination. It was a highly orchestrated, flawlessly executed corporate press event, masquerading as a wedding. It was the crowning achievement of a public relations department that operated with the ruthless precision of a military vanguard. When Jean Harlow and Paul Bern stood before the altar, the entire apparatus of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was operating at maximum efficiency to broadcast this manufactured triumph to the world. The setting was intimate, yet heavily curated, practically dripping with the scent of expensive white orchids and the invisible suffocating grip of contractual obligation. The guest list was not a gathering of beloved friends. It was a strategic assembly of Hollywood royalty, carefully chosen not for their personal closeness to the couple, but for the legitimacy, the gravitas, and the glamorous distraction their presence would project to the waiting public. Every smile, every handshake, every strategically shed tear was a performance demanded by the executives signing their paychecks. Louis B. Mayer, the chief architect of this unholy union, presided over the festivities with the smug paternal satisfaction of a king who had successfully quelled a dangerous peasant rebellion. He had neutralized his most volatile, highly priced asset. To the press, the narrative was spun with dizzying, sickening sweetness by the studio's army of fixers and copywriters. The wild, untamed platinum blonde, the cinematic homewrecker who threatened the moral fabric of America, had finally been domesticated by the gentle intellectual brilliance of the studio's most respected stabilizing executive. The Beauty and the Brains narrative was splashed across the front pages of every newspaper, gossip column, and fan magazine from Los Angeles to New York. Photographs of the newlyweds were meticulously staged, heavily retouched, and distributed with the efficiency of wartime propaganda. In these carefully framed images, Jean Harlow looks breathtaking, yet she is draped in a conservative, elegant gown that deliberately, almost violently, downplayed her usual raw, aggressive sexuality. She looked less like a bride and more like a captured prize successfully tamed. Paul Bern stands beside her, his diminutive frame visibly puffed up with a borrowed, terrifying pride. He smiles a tight, rigid smile, the smile of a man balancing on a tightrope over an abyss. To the millions of Americans suffering through the bleak, grinding poverty of the Great Depression, purchasing these magazines for a dime to escape their misery, it looked like a perfect, glittering fairy tale. It was, in reality, the beginning of a psychological horror story of unfathomable proportions. The moment the magnesium flashbulbs stopped popping and the heavy carved oak doors of their newly purchased Beverly Hills mansion closed behind them, the absolute crushing reality of their biological and psychological incompatibility descended upon the house like a suffocating toxic fog. The estate they retreated to, located at 9820 Easton Drive, was nestled deep within the winding, isolated, and heavily shadowed roads of Benedict Canyon. It was a Bavarian-style manor, a dark, cavernous architectural manifestation of gloom, entirely unsuited for the vibrant, effervescent 21-year-old girl who had just been legally bound to its walls. With its heavy wood paneling, narrow corridors, and oppressive atmosphere, it was not a home for a radiant young starlet. It was a house designed for hiding, and hiding was precisely what Paul Bern was desperate to do. The honeymoon phase of this disastrous marriage was a grotesque, exhausting pantomime. During the daylight hours, they were contractually and socially required to maintain the grand illusion for the town. They attended mandatory industry functions, hosted lavish, stiff dinner parties for studio executives where every word was measured, and played their assigned roles to absolute perfection. Harlow, desperate for the security and fatherly affection she had never truly known, acted the part of the devoted, adoring young wife, gazing at Bern with a manufactured, wide-eyed reverence. Bern, in turn, paraded her around the bustling MGM lot, absorbing the envious, hungry stares of other men. He wore her global status as the ultimate sex symbol, as a glittering, impenetrable shield to deflect any lingering whispered rumors about his masculinity. On the surface, the father confessor had conquered the ultimate prize, but nightfall brought the inescapable, agonizing truth of the bedroom. MGM's cleanup crew aggressively suppressed the details of their bedroom, but the historical consensus points to a singular, humiliating reality. Paul Bern's physical underdevelopment, his fundamental impotence, was not a secret he could keep from the woman sharing his bed. The protective armor of his intellect and his executive power vanished the moment the bedroom door clicked shut, leaving him entirely exposed to the reality of his own failing biology. The psychological torture of that specific scenario was absolute and unparalleled. Bern, a man existing in an era and a culture that strictly dictated a man's worth, was measured almost entirely by his sexual dominance and physical virility, was sharing a bed with a woman whose entire public identity, whose very career and massive fortune was built upon the premise of raw, unbridled, insatiable sexual desire. The contrast was not just ironic, it was heavily weaponized by their own insecurities. Every time he looked at her lying in the dark, he was reminded of his own perceived failure as a male. Every time she looked at him, she was confronted with the terrifying realization that she had merely traded one form of ruthless exploitation for another. She had escaped the predatory men of the industry, only to be trapped by the agonizing inadequacy of the man sworn to protect her. Harlow had sought a father figure, a wise and capable protector to shield her from her relentlessly manipulative mother, Mama Jean, and the aggressive, opportunistic men who constantly circled her like sharks. She found instead a fragile, deeply broken man who required more mothering, more coddling, and more psychological protection than she did. Forced to instantly grow up, she had to swallow her own needs, suppress the natural desires of her youth, and adopt the grim role of a psychological nursemaid to a man who was quietly, rapidly unraveling right before her eyes. Bern's mental state began to deteriorate with alarming, terrifying speed. The alpha male disguise he had so expensively purchased with a marriage certificate was proving far too heavy for his fragile psyche to carry. He had foolishly, desperately believed that merely marrying the platinum blonde would magically cure his profound feelings of inadequacy, that her sheer proximity would somehow instantly bestow upon him the virility he inherently lacked. When the exact opposite occurred, when her undeniable, radiant presence only served to magnify his shame tenfold, his despair morphed into a toxic, unpredictable volatility. He became obsessively, pathologically jealous. The wise, calm executive vanished, replaced by a paranoid jailer. He monitored her every movement. He intensely scrutinized her casual interactions with other men, reading betrayal into innocent conversations. He was terrified that she would inevitably leave him, terrified that she would expose his humiliating secret to the vicious Hollywood gossip mill, terrified that Louis B. Mayer and the studio executives would finally realize their prized intellectual executive was nothing more than a hollow shell playing dress-up. Driven to the absolute brink, he began to experiment with extreme, often dangerous artificial methods to overcome his physical limitations, desperately seeking a medical miracle in the back alleys of 1932 quackery, glandular treatments, supposed aphrodisiacs, and painful physical contraptions that only deepened his despair. When these desperate methods inevitably, predictably failed, his mounting frustration frequently boiled over into erratic fits of weeping, intense self-flagellation, and allegedly bursts of sudden physical aggression toward the woman he could not physically claim. The father confessor of MGM, the man who calmly, rationally solved the million-dollar problems of the biggest stars in the world from behind his massive desk, was completely incapable of solving the fundamental, agonizing tragedy of his own biology. And then the studio executives, operating with a sociopathic indifference to the private suffering of its employees, turned the temperature of the pressure cooker up to a lethal, explosive degree. Just weeks into her nightmarish, sexless marriage, Jean Harlow was abruptly ordered back to work to film the steamy jungle melodrama Red Dust. To compound Paul Bern's agony to an almost unbearable level, her co-star for this picture was Clark Gable, the undisputed, swaggering epitome of rugged American masculinity. Gable was everything Bern was not: tall, broad-shouldered, effortlessly dominant, and fiercely virile. The undeniable, scorching, on-screen sexual chemistry between his wife and Gable transformed Bern's private physical inadequacy into a daily, highly public humiliation. Bern, unable to stay away, frequently visited the sweltering sound stages. He stood in the dark shadows behind the massive camera rigs, a small, fragile, impeccably dressed man, watching as the studio silently, brutally compared him to the virile titan on the screen, and found the husband profoundly, pitifully lacking. He watched his wife perform a raw, tactile desire with Gable that she could never replicate in the cavernous bedroom on Easton Drive. The marriage that was specifically engineered to be his ultimate impenetrable disguise had swiftly transformed into a relentless, daily crucifixion. And as if the crushing psychological weight of his impotence and the towering, mocking shadow of Clark Gable were not enough to break him, the deeply buried ghosts of Paul Bern's past began to rattle their chains, threatening to completely obliterate the fragile manufactured reality he had built at MGM. Dorothy Millette, the fragile common-law wife he had callously hidden away in a psychiatric sanatorium on the East Coast years prior, was not a secret that could be buried forever, while the full extent of her movements remained shrouded in the chaotic, studio-mandated cover-up that followed. Historical and investigative evidence suggests that the radioactive secret of her existence was beginning to violently leak. Bern had dutifully paid her exorbitant medical bills for years through a highly complex, secretive web of intermediaries, desperate to keep her name completely and legally disassociated from his own ascendant career. But the massive, inescapable global publicity surrounding his wedding of the century to Jean Harlow had penetrated even the heavily guarded walls of the New York sanatorium. Dorothy Millette, suffering from severe, heartbreaking delusions and a mind fractured by abandonment, realized the devastating truth. The man who had cast her aside, the man who was legally under the strict tenets of common law, still her husband, had just married the most famous, desired woman in the entire world. The ongoing financial drain of keeping Dorothy permanently hidden in luxury was immense, constantly eating away at Bern's wealth. But the psychological terror of her potential exposure was paralyzing. In the rigidly moralistic era of 1932, operating under the looming threat of the Hays Code, the rules for executives were clear. If the press discovered that the highly respectable, morally upstanding father confessor of MGM was actually a bigamist who had locked his first mentally ill wife in an asylum to marry a young starlet, his entire life would be instantly, violently annihilated. Louis B. Mayer, who demanded absolute public perfection from his staff, would not lift a single finger to protect him. Mayer would mercilessly throw him to the wolves to protect the studio's bottom line. Bern would be ruined, disgraced, federally investigated, and cast permanently out of the glittering kingdom he had spent his entire adult life sacrificing his soul to conquer. By the first week of September 1932, the thick Bavarian walls of the East End Drive mansion were closing in on Paul Bern with the crushing, inescapable force of an industrial trash compactor. He was trapped in a sexless, agonizing marriage to a woman whose very existence constantly highlighted his deepest, most primal shame. He was being professionally and publicly humiliated on a daily basis by his wife's undeniable blazing chemistry with the ultimate symbol of cinematic masculinity. He was living in mortal, suffocating terror of his hidden, mentally ill wife, suddenly appearing to expose him as a bigamist, a liar, and a fraud. He had played a dangerous, high-stakes game of corporate engineering and personal deception, and as the summer faded, he realized with terrifying clarity that he had completely, irreversibly lost control of the board. The timeline of the final 72 hours of Paul Bern's life is a rapid, steep descent into a chaotic, claustrophobic nightmare, marked by violent arguments, desperate, hushed phone calls, and the total catastrophic collapse of his meticulously constructed sanity. Labor Day weekend, 1932. The oppressive, dry, suffocating heat of the Southern California summer hung heavily over the isolated canyons of Beverly Hills, trapping the smog and the tension in the basin. The Santa Ana winds blew through the dry brush, carrying a static electricity that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. The exact minute-by-minute sequence of events during that long, grueling weekend has been intentionally, permanently muddied by the studio's subsequent million-dollar cover-up. Yet, fractured eyewitness accounts from terrified staff members, nervous friends, and the later heavily guarded testimonies of Harlow herself paint a vivid picture of absolute domestic warfare. The tension in the dark house had finally reached its breaking point. Harlow's mother, the aggressively manipulative Mama Jean, and her opportunistic, parasitic husband, Marino Bello, were frequent, highly unwanted presences in the mansion. They constantly hovered, demanding money, interfering in the couple's private disputes, and adding fuel to the already raging fire of Bern's paranoia. Bern, the man who was universally known throughout the industry as the voice of calm mediation, was suddenly snapping, losing his temper with alarming, terrifying frequency, his sophisticated veneer completely cracking under the pressure. On Sunday, September 4th, as the oppressive heat of the day began to wane, a fierce, devastating argument erupted between Bern and Harlow. The exact subject of this final catastrophic fight remains one of Hollywood's most closely guarded, deeply buried secrets. Was it a final, tearful confrontation about his physical inadequacies and his bizarre, terrifying attempts to cure them? Was it a screaming match regarding her mother's relentless, shameless financial extortion that was bleeding Bern dry? Or had Harlow, perhaps through an intercepted letter or a whispered studio rumor, finally discovered the explosive existence of Dorothy Millette, the woman hidden in the East Coast sanatorium? Whatever the catalyst, the fight was an explosive detonation of 2 months of suppressed misery. Harlow, pushed to the absolute limits of her endurance by the suffocating deception, the emotional drain, and the volatile outbursts of the past 8 weeks, finally broke. She packed a bag with furious, trembling hands. She fled the dark, oppressive, terrifying house on East End Drive, slamming the heavy oak doors behind her and seeking refuge at the home of her mother. She drove away into the Los Angeles night, leaving her husband standing entirely alone in the cavernous, silent shadows of the mansion. It was the final, fatal abandonment. Paul Bern was left entirely alone with the monstrous, unrelenting echoes of his own colossal failures. The house, suddenly stripped of Harlow's vibrant, distracting presence, was no longer a home. It became a massive, terrifying mirror reflecting only his profound, inescapable shame. He was 42 years old. He had achieved immense wealth, commanding corporate power, and universal industry respect. He had successfully orchestrated the marriage to the most desired, lusted after woman on earth. And yet, beneath the bespoke suits and the executive titles, he was fundamentally broken. He was fundamentally incapable of being the man the world and his wife believed him to be. And he was absolutely terrified of the impending, unavoidable scandals that were about to drag him violently into the abyss. The dark, heavy hours of Sunday night slowly bled into the early, silent hours of Monday morning, September 5th. What truly transpired in the dark, silent halls of 9820 East End Drive during those final missing hours is a mystery that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer spent millions of dollars, called in countless political favors, and utilized decades of ruthless influence trying to permanently erase from human history. But the undeniable physical reality of the discovered scene spoke volumes about the absolute crushing depth of a human being's self-hatred when the facade finally drops. At some point during the darkest part of the night, Paul Bern walked slowly into his luxurious, expansive mirrored bathroom. He did not wear his immaculate tailored suits that signaled his executive power. He did not wear the expensive imported silk robes of a Hollywood elite. Methodically, he stripped himself entirely naked. For a man whose entire life, whose deepest psychological torment was defined by the profound shame and perceived inadequacy of his physical body, to choose to end his life or to violently meet his killer in a state of absolute, unvarnished nudity is an act of ultimate, brutal vulnerability. It is not an accident. It is a surrender. It is a man finally, utterly stripping away the expensive corporate disguises, the fake smiles, and the studio-mandated narratives, forcing the world to finally look at the broken, inadequate, unadorned reality he had spent a lifetime trying to hide. He stood in front of the cold glass mirrors, surrounded by the expensive perfumes, the discarded makeup, and the lingering ghostly scent of the beautiful young wife who had just fled from him in terror. He was holding a heavily blued .38 caliber revolver. A single gunshot rang out in Benedict Canyon. It was the brutal, abrupt end to a 2-month corporate lie. The heavy bullet entered his skull, instantly ending the agonizing psychological torture, the relentless deception, and the paralyzing terror of Paul Bern. His small, naked body slumped to the floor, coming to rest in a pool of rapidly expanding blood, the pristine white tiles of the bathroom serving as the final gruesome canvas for his despair. The sun rose over Los Angeles on Monday, September 5th, 1932. The city began to wake up, entirely unaware that the most meticulously constructed public relations campaign in the history of the motion picture industry was currently bleeding out on a bathroom floor in Beverly Hills. Before the first police siren could even be considered, let alone sounded, the studio's clandestine shadow government had already been fully mobilized. When Paul Bern's naked, bullet-riddled body was discovered slumped on his pristine bathroom floor, the LAPD wasn't called. Instead, the first frantic, hushed telephone calls went directly to the executive suites of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. MGM's apex fixers, the ruthless Eddie Mannix, and the brilliant but morally flexible boy wonder Irving Thalberg, arrived first to sanitize the gruesome crime scene. They did not arrive as mourners paying respects to a fallen colleague. They arrived as cold-blooded corporate surgeons, ready to aggressively excise a malignant tumor. For 2 critical hours, the Bavarian mansion on Easton Drive was not a protected legal crime scene, but a studio backlot under emergency set dressing. Mannix, a man whose entire formidable career was built on burying the most grotesque sins of the Hollywood elite, moved with chilling, methodical efficiency through the blood and the gore. He ruthlessly pocketed any incriminating evidence, personal letters, private diaries, and potentially damning artifacts of a failed, tormented life. He then handed a cryptic, highly questionable apology note to the severely corrupted LAPD upon their heavily delayed arrival. Mannix and Thalberg concocted a bulletproof narrative entirely on the fly. Bern had killed himself out of an unbearable, insurmountable shame over his own physical impotence. The Los Angeles justice system did not investigate. It simply took dictation from the studio. A sham coroner's inquest was hastily organized, functioning as a theatrical production designed merely to rubber stamp the studio's carefully crafted fiction. The proceedings were a mockery of jurisprudence, transforming Jean Harlow from a potential suspect in a violent domestic fatality into a tragic, beautifully grieving virginal widow who had been deeply wronged by a deceitful man. The LAPD and the coroner asked no difficult questions, completely laundering the crime scene for MGM. With the police and the coroner safely out of the way, the studio could now focus on the ultimate goal of this entire blood-soaked operation, cashing in on the tragedy. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, an atmosphere of suffocating panic gripped the executive offices of MGM regarding the upcoming release of Harlow's new film, Red Dust. The film paired her with Clark Gable, and it was undeniably, aggressively sexual, a humid, sweating, visceral piece of cinema that pushed the boundaries of the era. Cautious executives were terrified. They feared that releasing a steamy, highly erotic film starring a woman who is currently plastered across the front pages of every newspaper in America as a grieving, tragic widow would be seen in horribly poor taste. They anticipated a massive organized backlash from religious organizations and moral crusaders who might view the film as highly inappropriate, potentially triggering devastating box office boycotts. Louis B. Mayer, however, operated on a completely different psychological frequency. He possessed an unparalleled, almost sociopathic instinct for the dark, voyeuristic desires of the American public. While his subordinates trembled at the thought of bad press, Mayer saw a golden, unrepeatable opportunity. He overruled the cautious executives with absolute dictatorial authority. He ordered the release of Red Dust to proceed exactly as planned, mere weeks after the blood had been scrubbed from the bathroom floor on Easton Drive. Mayer understood a fundamental, grotesque truth about human psychology. Tragedy, scandal, and the proximity to violent death do not repel audiences. Rather, they act as the ultimate irresistible aphrodisiac. When Red Dust hit the theaters in the late autumn of 1932, the public response was staggering, proving Mayer's monstrous calculus entirely correct. The lines wrapped around city blocks, sprawling into the streets in a frenzied scramble for tickets. The grand movie palaces were packed to absolute capacity, filled with an electric, morbid anticipation. The audiences were not just going to see a romantic drama set on an Indo-Chinese rubber plantation. They were going to the theater to participate in a massive, collective act of morbid voyeurism. They were watching Jean Harlow on the silver screen, looking impossibly beautiful, bathing in a rain barrel, and generating volcanic, palpable sexual chemistry with Clark Gable. And as they watched her every sultry move, every single person in the dark theater possessed the exact same dark, unspoken context. They were watching the woman whose husband had just blown his brains out because he was physically incapable of possessing her. The studio's brutal, calculated character assassination of Paul Bern had inadvertently, or perhaps brilliantly, weaponized the inherent eroticism of the film. Harlow was no longer just a talented actress playing a sultry part. She had been instantly elevated to a mythological status. She was a sexual force so powerful, so dangerously unattainable, that it literally drove a senior studio executive to put a gun to his head. The contrast between the weak, impotent, dead executive buried in the ground and the rugged, dominant, virile Clark Gable dominating the screen was intoxicating to the audience. They watched Harlow playfully banter and fiercely flirt with Gable, and they willingly, eagerly projected the gruesome real-life tragedy onto the celluloid fiction. The movie was no longer just a piece of escapist entertainment. It was a psychological thriller fueled by the spilled blood of Paul Bern. Red Dust shattered all industry expectations and became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. It was a colossal runaway financial triumph that definitively solidified Jean Harlow's status as the undisputed queen of Hollywood, and simultaneously cemented Clark Gable's position as the undisputed king. MGM's executives had executed a flawless, entirely ruthless maneuver. They had taken a massive, potentially ruinous scandal, the violent, highly suspicious death of a senior executive in the home of their biggest, most expensive star, and they had alchemized it into pure, unadulterated profit. Louis B. Mayer sat comfortably in his heavily guarded executive suite, reviewing the astronomical box office returns with deep, paternal satisfaction. The brutal gamble had paid off perfectly. The forced marriage had been a success. The subsequent cover-up had been a success. The complete public destruction of Paul Bern's dignity had been a phenomenal success. The studio emerged richer, more culturally powerful, and more completely untouchable than ever before. The case of Paul Bern was effectively closed. He was buried in a quiet, highly sanitized ceremony, remembered by the public only as a tragic, inadequate punchline to a dirty Hollywood joke. Jean Harlow dutifully returned to the sound stages, trapped tighter than ever in the gilded golden cage of her own immense stardom, her life permanently managed and dictated by the very men who had orchestrated her living nightmare. The MGM executives confidently believed they had tied up every loose end. They believed they had successfully rewritten reality itself, burying the inconvenient truth right alongside the corpse. But they had made one critical, fatal miscalculation. In their frantic, 2-hour pillaging of the Easton Drive mansion, Eddie Mannix and Irving Thalberg had focused entirely on controlling the narrative directly surrounding Jean Harlow. They had removed the compromising documents. They had secured the narrative via the planted suicide note, and they had successfully manipulated the LAPD. But they had forgotten about the ghost that haunted Paul Bern's past. They had forgotten about the woman whose very existence threatened to expose the entire marriage as a bigamous fraud. The story exposes the extreme cruelty of the MGM power machine during Hollywood's golden age, where people were turned into scapegoats for the fame and interests of the corporation. At the heart of this tragedy is Dorothy Millette, the common-law wife of CEO Paul Bern. To pave the way for his ambition to rise to power, Bern heartlessly abandoned her in a mental institution, using money to cover up the truth. He brazenly donned the facade of a prestigious bachelor to marry the sex symbol Jean Harlow, thereby completely erasing Dorothy's existence from his life. This brutal deception ultimately led to Paul Bern's bloody death. Historical evidence suggests that Dorothy was present in Los Angeles on the night Bern died. Whether she was the one who fired the gun or her appearance pushed Bern, who was panicking at the prospect of being exposed for bigamy, to the brink, MGM intervened with a dirty hand. Eddie Mannix, the garbage collector, immediately destroyed all evidence of Dorothy's presence at the scene, fabricating the entire case as a suicide due to a physiological defect to protect Harlow's career and the film studio's stock price. However, the real blade that ended Dorothy's life was the studio's despicable whitewashing campaign. Forced to read news reports exposing her husband's death, witnessing his public humiliation, and bitterly realizing she had been completely erased from human history, her already fragile psychological wall crumbled. Unlike the dramatic spectacle in Los Angeles, Dorothy silently threw herself into the cold Sacramento River from the Delta King. Her bloated, unidentified body, recovered a few days later, was the most powerful indictment. Monopoly corporations don't need to pull the trigger to kill. They kill by completely stripping the vulnerable of their reality, identity, and dignity until they have no choice but to disappear. The news reached Los Angeles, sending a final terrifying shockwave through the executive suites of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Louis B. Mayer and Eddie Mannix had believed the crisis was contained. They had buried Paul Bern. They had saved Jean Harlow. They had released Red Dust to massive box office success. Now a second corpse had surfaced, and this corpse had a name that could destroy everything. If the press connected the woman in the river to the dead executive in Beverly Hills, if they realized she was his common-law wife, the entire narrative of the innocent virginal Jean Harlow would collapse. Harlow would be exposed as a bigamist, a homewrecker who had married a married man, and the studio would be exposed as having covered it up. MGM had to act one final time. They had to deploy their influence, their lawyers, and their money to ensure that the death of Dorothy Millette was treated as an isolated, unrelated tragedy. They had to sever the narrative cord connecting the river in Sacramento to the bathroom in Beverly Hills. The final brutal mop-up operation was about to commence, ensuring that the blood of two human beings would never stain the pristine, profitable silver screen. The golden age of Hollywood was about to permanently bury its dead, sealing the tomb on one of the most ruthless corporate cover-ups in American history. The discovery of Dorothy Millette's bloated, waterlogged body in the reeds of the Sacramento River in mid-September 1932 should have been the catalyst that brought the entire Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer empire crashing to the ground. When the authorities pulled her from the water and successfully identified her as the common-law wife of Paul Bern, the Los Angeles Press Corps was handed the missing piece of a spectacular, deadly puzzle. The narrative line was direct, physical, and undeniable. The respected MGM executive, who had supposedly killed himself over his own physical inadequacies just days after marrying the world's most famous sex symbol, actually had a secret wife. And that secret wife had thrown herself into a river almost immediately after the scandal broke. In any functioning society governed by the rule of law, this discovery would mandate an immediate massive reopening of the Paul Bern investigation. It would necessitate subpoenas for Louis B. Mayer, Eddie Mannix, and Jean Harlow. It would require a forensic timeline to determine if Dorothy Millette had been at the Easton Drive mansion on the night of the gunshot. Los Angeles in 1932 was not governed by the rule of law. It was governed by the balance sheets of the motion picture studios. The final brutal mop-up operation executed by Eddie Mannix in the wake of Dorothy Millette's death is a masterclass in the terrifying efficiency of corporate power. The studio did not panic. They simply expanded the perimeter of their cover-up. MGM deployed its legal fixers and highly paid public relations operatives to aggressively manage the fallout in Sacramento. Their objective was singular: sever the narrative cord connecting the dead woman in the river to the dead executive in the bathroom. They could not completely deny her existence because the identification was official, but they could drastically minimize her relevance. The studio successfully pressured the press to frame Dorothy Millette not as a legitimate wronged wife whose arrival might have triggered a murder, but as a tragic, delusional footnote. They leaned heavily into her history of mental illness. They painted her as a sad, pathetic figure from Paul Bern's distant past, a woman who had simply become unhinged by the news of his suicide and decided to end her own life in a fit of sympathetic grief. They ensured that the timeline of her movements was intentionally blurred. The local police departments, thoroughly compromised by studio influence, showed absolutely zero interest in investigating whether she had traveled to Los Angeles before taking the river boat. They did not want to ask questions that might yield answers detrimental to the most powerful employers in the state of California. The deaths of Paul Bern and Dorothy Millette were officially, legally codified as two entirely separate, unrelated suicides. The file was permanently closed. But in the midst of this cold-blooded corporate maneuvering, a single extraordinary act of human empathy occurred. It is a detail that historians often overlook, but it is perhaps the most defining, heartbreaking moment of the entire saga. When it came time to bury Dorothy Millette, Paul Bern's estate did not step forward to cover the costs. The MGM executives, who had just spent millions protecting their assets, certainly did not offer a dime to bury the woman they considered a liability. Her biological family, estranged and distant, lacked the resources. Dorothy Millette was facing the grim prospect of being buried in an unmarked pauper's grave, the ultimate literal erasure of her existence. It was Jean Harlow who stepped in. The 21-year-old movie star who had been drugged, manipulated, and used as a corporate human shield by her employers quietly paid for the funeral of the woman who was her husband's secret wife. Harlow purchased a plot at the Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Colma, California. She paid for a dignified casket. She paid for a headstone. She did this entirely out of her own pocket, without seeking publicity, and in direct defiance of the studio's desire to simply make Dorothy Millette disappear. Harlow, the manufactured home wrecker and the ultimate sex symbol, possessed more fundamental human decency than the entire executive board of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer combined. She recognized Dorothy Millette not as a rival or a scandal, but as a fellow victim of the exact same machine. They were both women who had been used, discarded, and crushed by the ambitions of Paul Bern and the ruthless mechanics of the studio system. Paying for that funeral was Harlow's silent, dignified protest against the absolute coldness of the world she was trapped in. But Harlow's act of grace did not grant her a reprieve from the machine. With the scandals buried, Louis B. Mayer demanded an immediate return on his investment. She was ordered to wipe her tears, bleach her hair, and get back on the sound stage. This relentless, systematic commodification of her private life took a devastating toll on Jean Harlow's physical and mental health. She was working grueling schedules, relying heavily on a cocktail of studio-provided stimulants and sedatives. She was the highest-paid woman in America, adored by millions. Yet she was fundamentally treated as a piece of high-performance industrial machinery that was being run far beyond its red line limits. The final fatal breakdown of this machine occurred in the spring of 1937. Jean Harlow was 26 years old. She was on the set filming a racing comedy titled Saratoga, paired once again with her most famous co-star, Clark Gable. For weeks, Harlow had been complaining of severe fatigue, abdominal pain, and nausea. She was visibly gray, sweating profusely under the lights, and struggling to remember her lines. The crew noticed that her trademark vibrant energy was entirely gone. She was essentially a walking ghost. But the production schedule for Saratoga was tight, and the budget was strict. The MGM executives, led by Louis B. Mayer, were not interested in delays. The studio doctors examined her, dismissed her agonizing symptoms as a simple case of gallbladder trouble or a seasonal flu, and ordered her back to work. They did not send her to an independent hospital for a thorough examination. They gave her painkillers and pushed her in front of the cameras. The capitalist imperative of completing the film superseded any basic medical concern for the human being standing on the mark. On May 29, 1937, the reality of her physical collapse could no longer be ignored. Harlow was on the set, filming a scene with Clark Gable, when she was suddenly overcome by a wave of nausea and agonizing pain, so severe she could barely stand. She leaned against Gable, whispering that she could not continue. Only then, when the asset was physically incapable of performing, did the studio halt production. She was taken to her home. Even then, the studio attempted to manage her illness as a public relations issue rather than a medical emergency. They restricted access to her, downplayed the severity of her condition to the press, and relied on doctors who were more concerned with MGM's directives than with aggressive medical intervention. It was too late. Jean Harlow was suffering from end-stage renal failure, specifically uremia, a catastrophic condition brought on by severe, untreated kidney disease. Her body was rapidly poisoning itself. The toxins that her kidneys could no longer filter were building up in her bloodstream, causing massive internal swelling, cognitive failure, and unimaginable agony. As she lay dying in her bedroom, her body bloated and unrecognizable, the stark, brutal reality of her life came into final focus. She was the most famous woman in the world, surrounded by wealth, yet she was dying an agonizing, preventable death because the corporate entity that owned her had valued a shooting schedule over her health. On June 7, 1937, at the age of 26, Jean Harlow died. She had outlived Paul Bern by less than 5 years. The reaction of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to the death of their most profitable star is the ultimate sickening punchline to this entire tragic saga. Louis B. Mayer did not engage in quiet, dignified mourning. He immediately recognized that the sudden, tragic death of a 26-year-old global icon was the ultimate marketing opportunity. He seized control of her funeral arrangements and transformed her burial into an obscene, massive corporate spectacle. He orchestrated a funeral at Forest Lawn Memorial Park that rivaled a royal coronation. He invited the entire Hollywood elite, ensuring that the press captured every tear and every floral arrangement. He used the funeral to broadcast the wealth, the power, and the supposedly deep emotional bonds of the MGM family. He capitalized on her corpse just as efficiently as he had capitalized on her marriage and her widowhood. But the true, cold-blooded depth of the studio's depravity was revealed in what they did immediately after the funeral. Saratoga, the film Harlow was shooting when her kidneys failed, was only partially completed. The studio had invested heavily in the production, and they were facing a massive financial loss if the film was scrapped. Louis B. Mayer refused to take the loss. He ordered the production of Saratoga to resume. He hired a relatively unknown actress named Mary Dees to act as a body double for the deceased Jean Harlow. Dees was similar in build and hair color, but she was obviously not the platinum blonde. The studio employed a series of grotesque, disrespectful cinematic tricks to finish the movie. They dressed the body double in oversized floppy hats, trench coats with high collars, and had her hold binoculars or props in front of her face to obscure her features. They filmed her entirely from behind or in extreme wide shots. They hired a voice actress to dub over her lines, attempting to mimic Harlow's distinct brassy cadence. They spliced these newly filmed, deeply unsettling scenes together with the footage Harlow had completed while she was literally dying of kidney failure. They packaged this Frankenstein's monster of a movie and released it to the theaters less than 2 months after Jean Harlow had been placed in a crypt. The marketing campaign was completely shameless. They capitalized on the intense, morbid public grief surrounding her sudden death, heavily promoting Saratoga as Jean Harlow's final performance. The public, driven by the same voyeuristic hunger that had propelled Red Dust to the top of the box office after Paul Bern's death, flooded the theaters. They sat in the dark and watched a film where the leading lady was visibly ill in half the scenes and replaced by a faceless body double in the other half. Saratoga became the highest-grossing film of Jean Harlow's entire career. It was a massive financial windfall for MGM. The studio had managed to wring millions of dollars in profit out of a 26-year-old girl, literally working her into an early grave, capitalizing on her funeral, and then using a stand-in to monetize the unfinished scraps of her final days. This is the blood-stained legacy of the Golden Age. The architects of this cover-up faced no justice. Eddie Mannix remained the most feared fixer in Hollywood, and Louis B. Mayer continued to rule MGM as an autocrat. The true legacy of the Golden Age was not painted with gold. It was painted with the blood, the sweat, and the erased identities of the men and women who were fed into the machine, ground down to dust, and projected onto the silver screen so the rest of the world could dream in the dark.